Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Few people have sat at the intersection of faith and power quite like Mitchell Silk. He was the first Hasidic Jew to serve in a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed position as the Assistant Secretary for International Markets at the U.S. Treasury in Donald Trump's first term in office. There, Mitchell helps shape some of the most consequential economic decisions of the last decade. He negotiated the U.S.-China trade deal back in 2019. He led the $94 billion airline rescue plan during the pandemic and designed groundbreaking initiatives that redefined U.S. infrastructure diplomacy across Latin America. Mitchell's story is one of conviction, intellect, and quiet faith. In his new book, A Seat at the Table, Mitchell takes readers behind the scenes of some of these pivotal moments, into the car when they get the new draft of a Chinese offer on trade, and so much more, and reveals how his Jewish values, belief in God, Torah, and divine providence helped guide his public service. I talk with Mitchell about trade with China, the weaponization of finance against Israel, the art of diplomacy, and what it means to be visibly Jewish in the halls of Washington. It's a fascinating conversation, one that takes us into not only the world of economic diplomacy, but also what it means to be a devout Jew who's experiencing and working in the corridors of power. Have a listen. Mitchell Silk, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's really great to be here, Yaakov, and great to see you again. It was wonderful catching up in New York a couple of weeks ago at your wonderful book launch, and I was so honored to have introduced you.
Well, I appreciate that. And now we're here to talk about actually your book called A Seat at the Table, an inside account of Trump's global economic revolution. And I don't know that everybody who's going to be listening to this podcast is watching, so not everybody will know that you are a Hasidic Jew, and we're going to talk a bit about that, exactly what your journey has been to what can be described almost as the pinnacle of economic diplomacy in the world and what you did in the first Trump administration. But before we even get into the personal journey, I want to talk for a moment and start off with China, because it's obviously something that you have a lot of experience with. It still is, to a great extent, a great adversary of the United States. It's a country that is a great challenge also to the state of Israel, which is where my primary focus is, and looking at the role that it's been playing over the last couple of years with the war in Gaza and whether Israel is taking the right approach to China. So I'm curious, just at a very high level, 30,000 foot kind of altitude perspective, when you look at the situation right now, and obviously a lot is always changing, how do you view the position of China, the current the adversarial position, whether it's also vis-a-vis the United States, but also from the Israeli perspective? How should Israel be viewing what's happening right now in this clash of titans to some extent between America and China?
It's a great question, Yaakov, and I think the best way to look at it is maybe to zoom out and kind of rewind, let's call it, 20 odd years. Let's say set the stage, late 70s, early 80s into the 90s, late 70s, China kind of opened up to the United States, Deng Xiaoping ushered in policies that allow greater access to the Chinese market by foreign investors, a lot more trade. Big turning point in the late 1990s and early 2000s when China entered into the WTO and then became more actively involved in outbound investment. And it was to see the makings of where we are today, of a tremendous volume of predatory behavior in global markets, both on the trade front and on the investment front and on the finance front. And that's really the framing. There was very nice, interesting cooperation. A lot of people were excited about the China market from those first couple of decades, but when the rubber hit the road and folks started to recognize that the Chinese were engaged in utilizing unfair tactics in their trade and investment globally, pushback started, and the pushback was rather soft. And I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the United States administration. And let's go back to the early 2000s. Let's call it the last couple of years of Bush Jr. and the 8 years of the Obama administration, where the U.S. had identified some issues, put them on the table, and said, China, if we're going to be operating on a good level playing field for both countries, we need to identify the issues, talk about them, and sort them. What was abundant in that 10 years, Yaakov, was a lot of identifying issues and meeting for the sake of meeting and talking about issues, but not
dealing with them. Right.
Yeah. And that's really my starting point, which is that it wasn't until 2017 that the United States, through President Trump, stood up and said, banged his fist on the table and said, I've had enough and I'm not going to take any more of it. And that's what led to our engagement in the Phase 1 trade talks that ultimately led to a deal in January of 2020, where we said to the Chinese, we know what the issues are. We're not going to meet for the sake of meeting. We're going to meet for the sake of sorting issues. And that's what we did. We had a script. We had very concrete desired outcomes. They were not limited to trade issues. They covered the whole of the landscape of economic trade and finance and market issues, and we achieved some very good results. There was a pause of a number of years, largely brought by COVID, and also by, let's call it, inaction from the last administration, and we've kind of resumed that. So if I were to take and we're kind of in the middle of that brawl at the moment. And so if I were to take all of that backdrop and look at the question you put, it's really every country. I can only speak for, my knowledge is really most on the United States, looking at where that country is vis-a-vis China on all trade, finance, market, investment issues, and saying, if there's an insidious approach to relations with me, I'm going to call that out and I'm going to deal with it. And if there's issues in dealing with it, so be it. But the playing field must be level. And I've not done a ton of research into the position with China and Israel over the past couple of years, but it was in my portfolio when I was at Treasury. There were a couple of big issues on the table. Those issues related to very critical infrastructure in Israel. And I was very pleased with the outcomes. I think they were good for Israel, good for the region, good for the United States, and good for the world, relating to, at least one, probably two very large port facilities in Israel.
Right.
And that issue is not limited to infrastructure. There's a very significant technology, national security dimension to the equation. And if I were to identify any one issue that is worthy of Israeli policymakers' attention, it really is the tech dimension.
And Israel, I think, to a large extent, and we saw this in the first Trump administration when you were in your role, Israel did not fully appreciate, I think, the risks that were engaged here or involved in whether it was the port deal and leasing it to Chinese companies, whether it was desalination plants, and obviously technology. And I think there's been a change in Israel, definitely, in the awareness of what this does, especially when you want to continue to be a close ally of the United States and benefit from what we've seen over the last 2 years, definitely, of a very close military and intelligence relationship. But how would you explain it if, like, an Israeli comes to you and says, explain to me what it is that I need to be cautious of? How would you describe that to Israel?
So in the context of a tech deal, or
Well, in the context of whether it's a relationship and trade ties with China, whether it's economic relations, but obviously, as you know, right, it never just stays within the economic sphere. The Chinese use the economic sphere for their diplomatic leverage and to extend their diplomatic political power.
yeah. So I think it boils down to a couple of really, really simple points. One is that you're not always getting what you see. you might be getting much more than you actually see, and a lot of that may not be wanted. That's particularly relevant to intellectual property and kind of control and dangers relating to the protection of intellectual property. But another dimension of it is, I would say if it's an Israeli investor, keep the guard up, because, a lot of the work in which I was engaged at Treasury, which is really kind of a macro representation of the micro work that I did representing foreign investors in China for 3 decades, relates to Chinese government arm and tentacles into basically every dimension of the economy and every single transaction. And so a big issue that confronted us globally, both in trade and in investment, is the Chinese government's role in economic affairs broadly stated. And so how does that relate to the individual, to the company, to the potential Israeli partner? Capital costs are subsidized, financing costs are subsidized. So those guys are already at an economic tipped up advantage vis-a-vis all others, whether it's trade competitors or a potential partner. In so many instances, I saw a lack of respect for contractual rights, unwillingness or inability to look at what was clearly written on paper and stand by what was written there, and pretty significant use of economic coercion, where you get sucked into a deal to the point where you're a little bit more than pregnant, and then unable to make a U-turn when the situation might not be as good as it was presented on the front end. So, keep the guard up. Circumstances are not always as they appear to be. It's a lovely culture, a lot of mystique to it, rather enticing, but I think at the end of the day, appearances, enticements aside, the focus really has to be on the deal and what's being concretely presented, and guarding and protecting interests.
There's a great story that you tell in the book, basically kind of some tricks that they try to do, and how you, because you actually you spent a lot of time living in Asia throughout your career, and you speak and read Mandarin Chinese. There was a document that was given to you when you're with Secretary Mnuchin, who was the Secretary of Treasury. You're one of the few people. You're in the car. You're on the way to a meeting. This is about the trade talks, and this document is just completely unacceptable. And you're an hour or less on your way to the meeting. Describe to us what happened there.
It was a crazy situation, Yaakov. I mean, one that I've never ever been presented in terms of the enormity of the issue and the egregiousness of the process followed. And really, this issue is a great illustration. The point that you're bringing up is a great illustration of putting the substance aside. How egregious is their behavior? A very significant negotiating tactic of the Chinese was to play with process as a means to confuse and slow roll. And this was one of the greatest examples, which led to a second example that happened right after the car incidents to which you referred. So backdrop, very simply, is that President instructed a very small group, Secretary Mnuchin included, Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Ross, to formulate a document that we were going to table to commence our negotiations for the trade agreement that we desired. I was tasked with preparing the first draft of that document. I felt it was kind of the culmination of a 30-year, legal career. I finally get to draft this really cool, multi-dimensional document. I put it together in a couple of weeks. It went through the interagency process. Another few weeks after that, we tabled the document at least 2 weeks in advance of our first engagement, our first big plenary meeting with the Chinese. There was a delegation of certainly more than 50 people. I was on a military aircraft with Secretary Mnuchin, who led the delegation, Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Ross, Peter Navarro, a bunch of undersecretaries. Stopped over in Japan for gas, landed very early in the morning in Beijing. The agreement was to shower up and huddle at the embassy, about 50 people in a secure room at the embassy. The first order of business was that one of our local senior diplomats reported that the Chinese delivered their draft agreement that very morning. So we were going to meet at the state guest house at Diaoyukai like an hour from then. The document completely disregarded, our thoughtful first draft. It was in Chinese. There was no English translation delivered. Unlike ours, we delivered both English and Chinese versions. And their statement was that the Ministry of Commerce was going to use this document for the negotiations. There was a little bit of a discussion that got slightly heated about what the response would be. There was some language used by a couple of folks that was probably not so appropriate for mixed company. But the view was that we were going to disregard the Chinese document because it basically said nothing and it didn't address the issues. There wasn't enough time to go through the whole of the document. I was put in the car with the secretary, which was the first of 20, 30 cars. Motorcade is running through the main thoroughfares of Beijing until we got to Diaoyukai. And I was frantically trying to translate what was on the document. There would have been no way, Yaakov, to have gotten through the 15 pages of the document in the 18 minutes that we had from the embassy over to the guest house. And truth be told, slight statement against interest, I was schwitzing away. And I got caught on one technical term for poultry. I'm a finance lawyer, I deal with energy and infrastructure. I knew kind of what the character meant, but the context just wasn't hitting. We kind of got through that. We got to the table after everybody had filed in. Political kind of Beijing opera at its best. Everybody sat down. The then Vice Premier Liu He opened up very warmly and graciously, welcomed us. Our team was more than 50 people. His team was more than 50 people. Stately meeting room where Mao had entertained President Nixon. And after that, immediately after that, Secretary Mnuchin just said very calmly, responded in kind, thanking the Vice Premier for the welcome and the hospitality. He held up the agreement and said, thank you very much for your document. We're going to be using ours. And that was the end of that. So a great illustration. But I think the really more interesting one, Yaakov, was that after we filed into the room and all 50 of our people took their assigned seats, based on protocol negotiations that went on for at least 2 weeks prior to the meeting, we discovered that we were shorted by the Chinese one seat. And so the career official who'd been working on China matters for certainly more than a decade, living these issues, was unceremoniously escorted out of the room. I went out after the break, after about an hour and a half, and I saw our Deputy Chief of Mission in heated discussions with the head of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs Protocol Department. And the issue was what the story with the chair was. It had been negotiated and sorted. Our guy had not been making any progress for over an hour and a half. I stepped in with my best Mandarin and tried to sort through issues. I was unsuccessful after about 5 or 7 minutes. And I was about to give up after having tried nicely, having tried firmly. I just decided, in line with my rabbi's very, very good advice, never get into a brawl with an ignoramus because they'll bring you down to their level and then beat you on experience. I decided enough was enough, and if we had to lose the battle on the chair, so be it. It happened that the People's Bank of China governor, the head of China's central bank, who is a very dear friend of mine and ours, Yigang, was walking by, U.S. educated PhD, and I called him over in Chinese, and I said, Governor Yi, we have a little issue here. What's the issue? He got into it with the head of protocol, and similarly, he didn't make any headway. So it was at that point that I decided enough is enough. I turned to Governor Yi and I said, Mr. Governor, the next time you're in Washington, please allow me to invite you to my house. I would love to have you for dinner. I will cook and serve you a menu of delicacies. I'll serve you some home-infused great vodka, and I'll serve you some wonderful red Israeli wine. And you know what, Mr. Governor, in clear earshot of Mr. Protocol, you know what, Mr. Governor, in Chinese, you can have as many seats as my table as you like, at my table as you like. And I walked away. Guess what, Yaakov? We got our seat.
Mm-hmm. But what I just find it fascinating. It's a great story, but also just like the games that are played. I think people don't fully appreciate the games that are played in the world of diplomacy about issues of like a chair at the table.
Well, it's the really simplest response to your question, and I apologize for having sucked up 10 minutes with my funny stories to make the point of the Chinese use of psychological warfare to confuse and to slow roll.
That's that's what they did with the documents, and that's what they do with the chairs, and it's all part of this just game of diplomacy. I'm curious. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to China, but I want to also talk about your personal journey because I think that'll be very interesting for people who are regular listeners to the show. And we are the Jewish People's Podcast, so we're talking about issues that pertain to the Jewish people. I mean, again, if you're not watching this and you're listening, Mitchell looks like a ultra-Orthodox Jew, has a beard, big black kippah, wearing a suit, white shirt. You wear a black hat.
That I didn't wear a tie.
It's okay. No, we're Israeli, as you can see. I'm wearing a denim shirt. I'm laid back, but I mean, you've had quite the interesting life story. How did you get to this position of being the Assistant Secretary for International Markets, Assistant Secretary of Treasury? How did you find yourself living in the Far East in Asia, becoming so familiar with China? I mean, that's not the ordinary journey of a Jew from Brooklyn.
Yeah. So I would love to give you a simple answer and say that, dude, I had it all figured out and it was very calculated from when I was like 13 or 14 years old, but the answer is anything but that. And I can only attribute it, like simply and quite frankly, to a ton of hashgacha, a ton of providence, and a ton of hard work. And the story is a longer and circuitous one, but I'll give you the really, really short version. I was born and grew up in a very homogeneous Jewish family, traditional Jewish family in the suburbs of Chicago. My grandparents were all immigrants from Europe. My maternal grandfather came from a shtetl called Nadvorna, son and grandson of Seifrim and followers of the first Nadvorna Rebbe, the Rebbe of Mortgala, and he had a tremendous, tremendous impact on my life. Family circumstances changed very significantly when, right around the time of my bar mitzvah, we moved to Florida. My parents divorced. I decided I had to go out and help my mother financially. So I took a job, interestingly enough, in a Chinese restaurant, and how I ended up there called happenstance, called Hashgacha, is that there was a family that had moved into our neighborhood from Hong Kong, 3 sons in my immediate age group. They didn't really speak English very well. I was kind of helping them get acclimated to the United States. It was great shit, as it were. We were friends, and I got to work in a restaurant. I was making money. I started out as a dishwasher and a prep cook in the kitchen, chopping up, 100-pound bags of cabbage and onions. And then later got a break and was promoted to busboy, later waiter. And it was at the point that I became a waiter.
Big promotion.
Yeah, I kind of, it was clear to me that in order to maximize my earning potential, I really needed to learn the local lingo in order to communicate with the chefs, none of whom spoke English at all, in order to get my food out quickly and get the right orders so that my customers would be happy and they would give me bigger tips. And so I started to learn what I understood was Chinese. I became fluent in what I understood was Chinese, and about 4 years into it, I understood that the Chinese that I was learning was one of 8 dialects. Surprise, surprise, surprise. It was the dialect spoken by more than 90% of the Chinese in America, but less than 5% of the Chinese in China. And then I learned that the main dialect was Mandarin. So I set upon a journey of learning Mandarin. I studied at a 9-week intensive summer course at Middle Order College, went to Taiwan for a year, became fluent in Mandarin, and then my career progressed on college focusing on China and international affairs, law school focusing on Chinese law being a lever to get me into big law. And then after having established myself as a Chinese law expert, when U.S. firms were marching to Hong Kong to capitalize on the power and infrastructure market that the Chinese had opened up to foreign investment, I was able to capitalize on that by getting into a very good firm that was well known in project finance and literally was doing the biggest and most complex deals in energy and infrastructure in China and elsewhere in Asia, and then later in the U.S. when I came back in 2005. And built up a great expertise in the area. And surprise, 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 2017, President Trump won the election. 2 of his key campaign areas were China and infrastructure. And it was because of that that I was tapped by Treasury to join the administration. It's not your typical career path. It had its twists and turns. It was extraordinarily interesting and fulfilling. But when I look back on it, I kind of say, if you can't see the divine hand in that, then I don't know what to say. One thing that I find most interesting about the punchline of that, Yaakov, is that when I was a junior at Georgetown undergrad, I was in the School of Foreign Service, which is a feeder to the State Department. I said to myself, gee, do you want to take the Foreign Service exams? And then, assuming you do well enough, you'll get to be like a consular officer handing out visas and pick your exotic locale, fight your way up the ladder, fight over the parking space with 20,000 other career employees, and then maybe get to ambassadorial rank. Or do you want to have a career in a profession where you build yourself up and then maybe go in later as a political? I made the decision to do the latter. It was a 30-year play, and I have to say that it worked out extremely well because the job that I had at Treasury was certainly the best job I ever had in my life, and it allowed me to do some really, really impactful things, not just the China trade negotiations, but my last job was to implement $94 billion of relief to our U.S. airlines. My work saved 700,000 jobs. And I was able to put to use a lot of the expertise that I had gained as a lawyer in big law to implement that program, and so it was a great run. Call it happenstance. I prefer to call it hashgacha.
How does the Jewish faith and observance play a role in all of this for you?
Well, that is a very personal question, Yaakov, and my simple response is that it's my beginning and my end, but it stays on the inside. It's my driver. It pushes me. It aids me. It guides me. My religion, my thinking, my background, everything that I learned from my grandfather, everything that I've learned from my rebbes, my chavrusas. But I don't like to wear my religion on my shirt sleeve, as it were. I dress as I dress, and I look as I look. People can take from that what they like, but I've always found that my approach, which is our approach, and the approach of our fathers, as it were, has served me extremely well. When I've been in meetings with the undersecretary, with the secretary in the White House, I have found that my thought process, The ideas that I come up with, which have been informed by my background and my learning and my experience, have always been extremely impactful. I've always felt, and this is kind of a one-up that I believe we have, I know I can say very confidently that a good, appropriate small dose of Jewish humor has always carried the day.
Mm-hmm. That's it's very interesting, and it's quite the journey itself. You were recently in Taiwan with a group, I think it was from APAC, and there was a speech that was given by the president of Taiwan. And just important to point out that Israel has relations with Taiwan. It's not formal diplomatic relations. Obviously, this is because of what we spoke about in the beginning of our conversation about China. But the president of Taiwan referred to the very strong similarities between Israel and Taiwan, two countries, nations that are surrounded by enemies. Taiwan, of course, concerned about the possibility of a Chinese invasion. Israel, after going through the last 2 years, the president used the metaphor of David versus Goliath, referring obviously to Taiwan as David and China as Goliath. Talk to me, if you can, about, obviously, I'm curious what that was like in Taiwan now. I know you spent a lot of time there, also living there, but how should Israel look at this relationship with Taiwan? Because obviously it's complicated because of China. And do you think there's actually something? So it's a bit of a couple layers to this question. Do you think that the Chinese might actually do something with Taiwan?
Great area. You framed it really well. It's almost as if you were in the room. It was an exceptional evening, Yaakov. APAC really pulled out all of the stops, and they were supported locally by a fellow named Jeffrey Schwartz, who's built the most magnificent Jewish.
He's amazing. I've been to his community center there. It's incredible.
And
Yeah.
like without him, culturally, religiously, but in this instance, kind of politically, economically, financially, investment-wise, it was really an unbelievable visit. And the pinnacle of the visit, I think, as you pointed out, was that night where we had a big gala dinner. It was in one of the most beautiful hotels in Taiwan, the Grand Hotel, lovely ballroom, traditional Chinese red lanterns. It was beautiful. But what was most beautiful about it was the one speech and the one speech that you referred to and a couple of other speeches. The president spoke. The vice president, who was one of my former counterparts when I was at Treasury, gave some really impactful remarks. And both of those remarks did focus on the Israel-Taiwan relationship and the comparisons and the contrasts. It was a great night, and I look back on it, and I spoke a little bit about this when I did address the APAC delegation. There are tons of similarities between the two countries. Landlocked, as it were, surrounded by enemies, great economic dynamos punching way above their weight. The existential threats are very much the same. They both, an area that I've focused on a lot, are operating on the international plane against very significant trends and headwinds of diplomatic isolation, and yet they just continue. It's like the ever-ready bunny. Both countries just continue to go. I mean,
It's resilience. It's a very powerful resilience.
Yeah, you are expert on the Israel side. Let's look at the Taiwan side, which some of your audience may not be as familiar with. Small country, some people may not be familiar with it at all. It's an extraordinary dynamo with some of the most sound, per capita macroeconomic indicators on the face of the earth. They're extraordinarily strong exports in dollar terms and in terms of percentage of GDP, very high GDP, among the largest foreign exchange reserves in the world. And listen to this factoid, Yaakov. In terms of AI and semiconductors, Taiwanese corporates, and one company in particular, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, own and control over 60% of foundry capacity globally, not just like in Asia, not just in their country, but globally, right? Against the backdrop of everything that's going on in AI today. And how do you explain that both of these countries can have made it to where they are, and how they continue? I think you hit it on the head in the word resilience, which is a word that I was going to use, and also in terms of creativity. It's just extraordinary how the Taiwanese have been able to maintain and build. I look in my work at their financial markets. It's a great story, one worth reading about. But I think that the one item that I think is most interesting, like the biggest question, because like to look at similarities in a way it could be a little bit trite. But maybe two issues that I would focus on are, number one, the China issue is equally challenging to both countries, and I think that your audience has to be like really live and really aware to that issue. It's abundantly apparent because of the geography on the challenges that Taiwan has geographically. The typical Israeli might not be thinking about it, but if we look back at October 7th, right, and we look back particularly what happened in the wake of October 7th, particularly on the diplomatic international relations standpoint, and by the way, I loved your book, and I'm just about almost done with it, and you deal a little bit with this, but if we look at the financing of October 7th, let's call it 10 years prior, what's been happening after, more than a couple of shekels came from China.
Correct.
A lot of the disinformation, particularly on social media, which was not friendly to us, to our people, to our country, came from China. And so I think for the average person that might be listening, a key point is that these people are not necessarily friends. But the bigger issue that I have, and really this is a positive issue, I like to focus more on positive issues, is that I frequently wonder why it is that two countries that are so common in background, so common in existential values and existential missions, so common in performance, punching above weight, why the economic trade investment relations are not far more significant than they should be. A paltry $3 billion in annual bilateral trade.
Well, that's because of Israel's concern from China. No, that's pretty much the story.
I don't know. I've not looked into it, but why should the average Israeli trader be concerned about politically about buying from Taiwan? It's not necessarily, Yaakov, that people could track that even if they were minded to.
That's true.
So it's a paltry $3 billion in bilateral trade. There's certainly a ton of stuff from Taiwan that Israel could be buying. They've got wonderful agricultural other products, and similarly from the Israeli side. But let's put the trade stuff aside, right? I think back about the time that I was very heavily involved in my former law firm's activities in Israel and the Israeli market, when I used to travel there pretty frequently on marketing and sometimes on deal missions. And if I would be staying at one of the hotels on the beach in Tel Aviv, let's call it the Hilton, I remember in the early 2000s and even beyond that, and even in the early 20-teens, you'd go into the Hilton, and literally every other week, if not every week, there'd be a couple hundred Chinese that descend on the hotel that were there for the sole purpose of speed dating for potential VC investments. And I say to myself, why isn't more of that happening with Taiwan? Between Taiwan and Israel. I'm aware of only one person who is exclusively focused on kind of tech VC cooperation between Taiwan and Israel. And I think it's a great area to focus on, both in terms of growth and growing bilaterally, but also in terms of as a defensive measure and kind of defense dimensions.
This has been fascinating. Mitchell Silk, author of the new book, A Seat at the Table. I want to thank you for joining us on today's episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Yaakov. It's been really fun.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. Give us a 5-star ranking, please. It helps us. Send it to your friends and family. And we'll be back here soon in just a few days. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week. Take care.